Profesorka Univerziteta u Koloradu Elizabet Skjuz posle Novog Sada stigla je i u Niš. Sa novinarima je imala prilike da razgovara o tome kako mediji u Americi izveštavaju o masovnim ubistvima, ali i o tome kako poboljšati tu sliku u medijima kada su srpske televizije, portali i inače elektronski mediji u pitanju. Prvo pitanje koje postavljamo večeras u ovom našem ekskluzivnom intervjuu jeste da nam napravi paralelu o tome kako američki mediji izveštavaju o masovnim ubistvima, a kako su srpski mediji izveštavali o majskom ubistvu u Beogradu.
So, yeah, I think when you look at the coverage that came in the Serbian media, from what I've seen, there are some similarities to coverage that has occurred in the United States, particularly earlier on in the United States, as you look at very shooter-centered coverage in 1966 in the Texas Tower shooting, in 1999 at Columbine. You start to see after that a little more victim-centered coverage, but the U.S. has had such a long history with these things, and the media have been asking some questions of themselves as they've looked at some of that coverage that I think, from what I've gathered, journalists in Serbia are starting to ask themselves as a result of some of their coverage of the May shootings here.
Gde najviše greše mediji kada je u pitanju izveštavanje vezano za masovnu pucnju?
Different kinds of mistakes, and one is that kind of showing shooters, especially showing shooters with guns in their hands, because that can sometimes serve as almost inspiration for other would-be shooters. I think some of the other mistakes that media can make are putting more emphasis on the shooters than on the victims. And I think in the first few days of coverage, as we try to understand, why it happened, there's a lot of that exploration of the shooter, but the fact is that we're really never going to understand why. And it's more important to explore how a shooting happened and where maybe there were systemic failures, either in the schools, in some kind of investigative or agency. Does there need to be a system that allows people to report if they think somebody is going to be a danger to themselves or to other people? In the Lewistown shooting in Maine very recently, people were reporting that Robert Card, there was one of his work colleagues who said, I think this guy is going to be a mass shooter. Well, how do you report that, and then how do you get the attention of agencies, and what legal remedies are there to stop a would-be mass shooter? Those are all questions we can be asking that might prevent another mass shooting.
Ali to su sva pitanja koje postavljaju i ljudi koji se nađu na mestu masovne pucnjave, kako je razmišljao ubica, kako je dovelo do toga. Kako sada novinar da se postavi na najbolji mogući način da da odgovor na ta pitanja, ukoliko su uopšte bitna, kao što ste rekli, a da ipak ne povredi ni jednu stranu u toj priči, žrtvu, na primer, porodicu žrtve i tako dalje?
So the question, the very question, right? Why? What we know is that maybe a killer left notes, a suicide note, or a manifesto, or something, but all of that is just surface level explanation. It doesn't, in many ways, it doesn't matter if somebody was bullied. If bullying is a problem in a school, then bullying is a problem that the schools need to deal with and need to figure out. But there are many kids who get bullied. There are many kids who bully who do not become mass shooters. So it's not really an explanation. It's almost an excuse. What we need to do instead, I think, is make that part of our longer term reporting to understand from the research and from psychologists and psychiatrists and other health experts, what do they know about patterns that might be found among different mass shooters? And I realize Serbia is different than the United States, but we've had a lot of them. Maybe there are some patterns that can be borrowed from mass shootings in the United States that we can start to understand better. What are the factors? What are the common threads? Then we might begin to understand. But one person and one person's kind of letters or manifestos or whatever aren't going to tell us very much. And so I think the better explanation to the public is we need to study this more. We need to put more effort into first prevention and those systemic failures, and then into the research that will tell us more about this. But just digging into this one person's life doesn't tell us why he became a shooter.
I kada već pričamo o tome, oko istraživanja, malo čas smo čuli interesantan deo predavanja vezan za intervjue sa žrtvama. Kakav tu savjet možete da date novinarima?
First and foremost, these people have been traumatized by this. And one of the primary goals of any journalist should be not to add to that trauma. And so being very gentle in an approach to an interview, giving the victim a lot of control over the interview are all very helpful. And then there is this technique, forensic experiential trauma interview, which recognizes that somebody who has been traumatized has a brain that is trying to protect them from some of the worst of the information, things they're not ready to cope with. And so if you can ask people about what they remember, about sensory memory that they might have from the event, they can do, the interview is easier for them than if you ask them to tell the story in a very straightforward, linear fashion. So that's also part of giving them control and letting them tell their story in the way that they are most comfortable. It's really that kind of simple.
Kako naći u današnjem trenutku savremenom najbolji balans između novinarske etike i onoga što nam sada nameće savremen internet, savremeno društvo, te klikabilne naslove da što pre budemo vidljivi, da budemo što čitaniji na internetu, opet zadržati tu etiku izveštavanja?
And this is difficult, I know it is. Each news organization kind of needs to have conversations, figure out where they're comfortable with the coverage, and almost turn a blind eye to what might happen on the internet or what might happen on social media, because there is a lot of really awful coverage, awful, right, things that go out on the internet. Just a couple of days ago, 3 diary pages from the person who was the shooter at the Nashville Covenant School, an internet person who calls himself a journalist, released those 3 pages. He got a hold of them. So far, U.S. news organizations, mainstream media outlets aren't following, right? They have reported that those pages are out there. If somebody else wants to go find them, I'm sure they can. But they're doing responsible journalism by saying, we don't need to see those. Those pages don't tell us anything. They don't provide any greater insight into the shooter's mind. All they are is just noise, and they're treating it like noise. And I think that when news organizations can, not in the heat of the moment, but again, we've had more of these in the U.S., so a lot of news organizations have started to come up with a clearer idea of what they will do and what they won't, what is within their kind of moral compass, if you will, and what is not. And showing the writings of a shooter, they're just not going to do it, even if it shows up on the internet.
Pošto je hronika nekako najčitanija rubrika svuda, gde god i o svim medijima i čini mi se u svim državama, da li negde možemo da se plašimo da će novinarstvo da izgubi trku u budućnosti od tog mobilnog žurnalizma, odnosno od tih društvenih medija koje objavljaju priče u izvornom obliku, a publika ih guta u mnogo većoj količini nego što bi danas novinari to želeli, na način na koji se to danas radi?
Wow. I think that we have, because of our social media habits, the public has a relatively short attention span, and can be drawn more readily then to something that is more sensational, or shiny, right, being talked about. and I understand that news is a business. It's not just a philanthropy for journalists. Still, when news starts to turn its attention, especially in times of trauma, to competing with the story that will get the most clicks or the most likes or the most attention, we risk circling the drain. We risk going down in the gutter, essentially, with some of the worst of media coverage. And I'm using media broadly there to include social media. Journalism that wants to be credible, and I think there is space in the world for journalism that sticks to the higher ground. Doesn't necessarily go for profitability in the moment, but thinks about the long term and thinks about how do I build a readership, a viewership, an audience that knows they can trust me to be thorough, to be fair, and to be merciful, and not to just chase after the most salacious aspect of a story for a short-term gain in my clicks, right? My metrics from Google or whatever. Like, there are stories that cry out for us to do the right thing and not the easy thing, and these are trauma stories or those kinds of stories.
Da li to znači sada poslednje pitanje za kraj, da ne treba da se brinemo o veštačkoj inteligenciji, jer jedino novinar može da ima pravi pristup doživljaju, odnosno tom dešavanju tomu?
I think so. I don't think AI can tell these kinds of stories. AI can kind of gather information. AI can, give us patterns. All of that is helpful in some ways, I suppose. AI can't connect us to other human beings. In fact, it's the antithesis of being able to connect us to other human beings. Journalism can do that. Journalism can dig and find out things that nobody, the government may not want us to know, or that organizations might not want us to know, that schools might not want us to know. So journalism can do all of those stories. AI cannot. And in this space around mass shootings and around trauma, it needs journalists, not artificial intelligence, and not somebody with a cell phone who thinks they're a journalist. We need journalists to do this work.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.